They wore suits, smiled for cameras, and swore oaths to the Constitution. But behind the polished speeches and patriotic flags was something far colder. Strategy over sincerity, control over compassion, fear over love. These were not just presidents, they were princes, and in their hands, the White House became a throne. This is how Machiavelli's brutal blueprint of power didn't die in Renaissance Italy. It moved into Washington, D.C. The Machiavellian blueprint, from Florence to Washington. Niccolò Machiavelli never sat in a presidential office. He never governed a superpower. Yet his insights on power, control, and leadership have echoed through the corridors of the White House for more than 2 centuries. Though written in the early 1500s for the rulers of fragmented Italian city-states, the Prince became an unintentional manual for some of the most powerful men in modern history. American presidents. Machiavelli's central idea was radical: a ruler must be willing to sacrifice virtue to preserve the state. Morality, in his eyes, was often an illusion, a performance maintained to win public favor. Real power was sustained not by idealism, but by shrewd strategy, cold decisions, and the calculated use of fear, deception, and coercion. As he famously advised, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." In the context of American democracy, this may seem contradictory. After all, the United States was founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and justice. But look deeper, not at what was promised, but at what was done. Examine how the office of the president evolved from a constitutional role into the most powerful executive authority in the modern world. Behind the ideals, Machiavellian logic guided the rise of presidential power, especially in times of crisis, war, and transition. From the beginning, the Founding Fathers feared the concentration of power, yet they also recognized its necessity. The presidency was designed to balance authority with accountability. Yet history shows that presidents have repeatedly pushed those boundaries, invoking emergencies, expanding executive orders, and acting unilaterally in the name of national interest. In many cases, what was justified as patriotism was, in effect, Machiavellian maneuvering. Consider the notion of reason of state, the idea that a ruler must do whatever is necessary to protect the nation, even if it contradicts laws or values. Machiavelli championed this principle as a practical reality of leadership. In the American context, we see it in moments such as Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, FDR consolidating federal power during the Great Depression, Nixon's secret diplomacy and surveillance under the guise of national security, Bush's Patriot Act following 9/11. These were not isolated events. They were expressions of power rooted in Machiavellian realism, a belief that appearance matters more than truth, that enemies must be neutralized swiftly, and that lasting change often requires moral compromise. Machiavelli did not advocate cruelty for its own sake. Rather, he believed in calculated cruelty, actions taken only when necessary and ideally all at once to shock the system into order. Many U.S. presidents, knowingly or not, have followed this model, executing controversial policies rapidly, consolidating control, and then shifting the narrative toward unity, healing, or patriotism. Even today, presidential campaigns reflect his insight that politics is performance. Candidates tailor their image to appear strong yet empathetic, decisive yet moral, precisely the balance Machiavelli recommended to preserve legitimacy while wielding power. The irony is sharp. Machiavelli was condemned in his time and often portrayed as immoral. Yet the very tactics he described became the backbone of modern leadership, not only in autocracies, but in the very heart of democratic republics. So, when we speak of Machiavelli in the White House, we are not suggesting a direct lineage of thought, but a deep structural similarity between the principled cynicism of the prince and the practical decisions made by American presidents. This keynote sets the stage. The White House is not just a house of laws, it's a theater of power, And behind every executive decision lies a simple, brutal question Machiavelli would ask: will this preserve my rule and secure the state? Abraham Lincoln, the prince who suspended liberty to save the republic. Abraham Lincoln is widely celebrated as a moral visionary, the emancipator, the savior of the Union, the martyr of democracy. His face adorns monuments and currency, and his words are quoted as gospel in American civic religion. But beneath the myth lies a leader who wielded power with ruthless calculation, strategic ambiguity, and political cunning, traits Niccolò Machiavelli would not only recognize but deeply admire. At the heart of Machiavellian philosophy is the idea that a ruler must be willing to act immorally when the survival of the state is at stake. Lincoln embodied this principle more than most. During the Civil War, the very fabric of the United States was unraveling. 11 southern states had seceded. The capital itself was vulnerable. Congress was divided. In such an environment, Lincoln did not rely solely on appeals to unity or morality. He used raw executive power to hold the nation together. The most striking example of this is Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, the constitutional right protecting individuals from unlawful detention. Citing rebellion and public safety, Lincoln bypassed Congress and authorized the military to arrest and imprison thousands without trial, including journalists, judges, and state legislators sympathetic to the Confederacy. While many viewed this as unconstitutional, Lincoln defended it as a necessary act of war, a move Machiavelli would interpret as the ruler placing the security of the state above legal norms. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes, "A wise ruler must not mind incurring the reproach of cruelty for the sake of keeping his subjects united and loyal." Lincoln's actions fit this frame precisely. He prioritized national unity and survival over procedural purity. He understood that laws mean nothing if the state itself collapses. Another example is the Emancipation Proclamation, perhaps Lincoln's most celebrated act, but it was not initially driven by idealism alone. For the first year of the war, Lincoln resisted calls to abolish slavery, fearing it would alienate border states and weaken the Union's cause. Only when he saw that emancipation could weaken the Confederacy, by encouraging slave rebellion and depleting the Southern labor force, did he declare slaves in rebel-held territory forever free. Notably, this did not free slaves in Union-controlled areas. It was, first and foremost, a strategic war measure designed to shift momentum and redefine the moral high ground. This doesn't diminish Lincoln's moral compass. It highlights his strategic patience. Machiavelli advised rulers to wait for the opportune moment and never act based solely on abstract virtue. Lincoln followed this pattern. He timed his proclamations, managed public perception, and slowly redefined the war from one of Union preservation to one of moral purpose, all while consolidating military and political power. His use of rhetoric, too, was Machiavellian. He often employed ambiguity in public statements to keep critics off balance. He positioned himself as reluctant yet resolute, a man burdened by duty rather than thirst for control, a calculated posture Machiavelli considered essential for winning popular support while executing difficult decisions. Internally, Lincoln managed a fractious cabinet filled with rivals, men who once opposed him but were brought into the inner circle. This team of rivals approach allowed Lincoln to neutralize opposition, gather intelligence, and ensure loyalty, a tactic straight from Machiavelli's playbook: keep your enemies close and make them dependent on you. In the end, Lincoln preserved the Union, reshaped the nation's purpose, and set the precedent for wartime executive authority. His assassination in 1865 immortalized him as a martyr, but his legacy is more complex and more Machiavellian than most realize. His presidency demonstrates a brutal truth: great leadership in crisis often requires breaking the very rules one is sworn to uphold. In saving the Republic, Lincoln temporarily suspended liberty, manipulated public opinion, and exercised near dictatorial powers, not out of tyranny, but out of a cold, strategic commitment to national survival. He didn't destroy democracy. He preserved it, with iron in one hand and illusion in the other. Franklin D. Roosevelt. The illusion of calm, the machinery of power. Franklin D. Roosevelt is remembered as the steady hand that guided America through two of its greatest crises, the Great Depression and the Second World War. His speeches radiated confidence, hope, and reassurance. He projected the image of a calm, compassionate, and noble leader, the very portrait of democratic integrity. But behind that image was a master strategist, one who wielded power with discretion, deception, and centralization in ways that would make Machiavelli quietly nod in approval. Roosevelt's presidency, spanning over 12 years, marked a seismic shift in the balance of American governance. It was under FDR that the executive branch evolved from a coordinating office into the central engine of national policy. What made this transformation so effective was not merely the power itself, but the way Roosevelt concealed the iron fist beneath a velvet glove. In The Prince, Machiavelli warns, a ruler must appear all mercy, all faith, all honesty, all humanity, all religion, and yet be ready to act entirely against these qualities when required. Roosevelt's career was a masterclass in this principle. During the Great Depression, FDR launched the New Deal, a series of sweeping reforms and federal programs aimed at stabilizing the economy and providing relief. On the surface, the New Deal was an act of compassion, but beneath it was a massive consolidation of federal authority with new agencies, executive orders, and emergency powers all resting under presidential oversight. Roosevelt maneuvered Congress skillfully, bypassed critics, and expanded the role of government in ways that reshaped American capitalism and social structure permanently. FDR understood the value of fear, not just managing it, but using it. His famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," was not just rhetorical brilliance. It was a carefully calibrated message, one that soothed the public while subtly justifying extraordinary executive actions. Fear was turned into a political instrument. It gave FDR moral license to act unilaterally, reshape the economy, and demand loyalty from institutions and industries alike. When the Supreme Court began to strike down parts of the New Deal, Roosevelt responded not with compliance, but with one of the most controversial power plays in American legal history, the court packing plan. He proposed expanding the number of justices, allowing him to appoint loyalists and tilt the balance of power. Though the plan failed legislatively, the pressure campaign worked. The court began upholding his reforms. Machiavelli's advice again echoes, "If you cannot change the law, change those who interpret it." Roosevelt's Machiavellian strategy extended into foreign affairs as well. Prior to Pearl Harbor, he knew the threat posed by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but public opinion was deeply isolationist. Rather than confront this head-on, FDR moved incrementally, supporting allies through the Lend-Lease Act, aiding Britain and China with weapons and supplies, and positioning the US for war without openly declaring it. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt responded instantly, but his preparations had already laid the groundwork for entry into global war. Once at war, FDR expanded his control over intelligence, production, and diplomacy. He held secret negotiations with Churchill and Stalin, approved covert operations through the OSS, precursor to the CIA, and crafted a post-war vision that placed America at the center of a new world order. The formation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, and global military bases all emerged from Roosevelt's strategic foresight. Importantly, Roosevelt never lost his popular image. He maintained a persona of benevolent leadership even as he centralized power, maneuvered institutions, and guided the nation into war. He hid his paralysis from the public for years, carefully controlling his public appearances to project strength, just as Machiavelli advised rulers to guard appearances above all. FDR was not a tyrant. He was, arguably, the most effective democratic leader in American history, but his success did not stem from idealism alone. It came from his understanding that leadership in crisis requires more than virtue. It requires command, calculation, and sometimes control of perception. He did not overthrow democracy. He made it stronger by mastering the tools Machiavelli laid bare: fear, illusion, timing, and control. Lyndon B. Johnson, dominate Congress, divide to rule. Lyndon B. Johnson was not the idealist his speeches suggested. He did not rise from poverty to power by accident. He rose because he understood what many in Washington only pretended to. That politics is about leverage, fear, and dominance, not just persuasion or principle. As president, Johnson mastered the mechanics of power with a ruthless efficiency that Niccolò Machiavelli would have deeply admired. LBJ entered the presidency in 1963 under tragic circumstances following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But instead of merely preserving Kennedy's legacy, Johnson seized the moment, expanded his authority, and transformed the federal government more profoundly than any president since FDR. His domestic agenda, known as the Great Society, redefined the role of the federal state in education, health care, and civil rights. But none of it was achieved through soft words or moral appeals alone. It was hard-nosed political warfare. In The Prince, Machiavelli advises, "A ruler must learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge as necessity requires." Johnson's political career was built on this principle. Before becoming president, he served as Senate Majority Leader, where he developed a legendary reputation for manipulation, intimidation, and strategic alliances. His tactics were so effective that Washington insiders coined a term for them: the Johnson treatment. A blend of charm, flattery, threats, and pressure delivered in intense physical proximity. He would lean in, stare down senators, and speak in a low, commanding tone until they surrendered. This aggressive style followed him into the White House, where Johnson used every tool of influence to push through landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These were moral achievements, no doubt, but they were also deeply strategic. Johnson used the public sympathy following Kennedy's death to shame Congress into compliance. He made promises to conservatives behind closed doors, cut deals with moderates, and wielded the power of patronage mercilessly. Machiavelli emphasized that a ruler must know when to divide and conquer, and Johnson understood this instinctively. He exploited divisions within both parties, playing Southern Democrats against Northern liberals and Republicans against each other. He made people compete for his favor, keeping them loyal not out of love, but out of necessity and fear of exclusion. His cabinet and advisors were often uncertain, off-balance, and dependent, a hallmark of Machiavellian rule. On the world stage, Johnson's Machiavellian side became even more pronounced. As the war in Vietnam escalated, LBJ faced mounting criticism and political risk. Yet instead of withdrawing or leveling with the public, he chose a path of strategic distortion. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, a murky naval confrontation off the coast of North Vietnam, was used by Johnson to secure nearly unlimited war powers from Congress. The details of the event were ambiguous at best, but Johnson capitalized on it as a crisis, echoing Machiavelli's view that occasions must be seized when they arise. Even as anti-war protests erupted and public trust began to erode, Johnson maintained the appearance of control. He used patriotic rhetoric, manipulated intelligence, and pressured the media to align with the administration's version of events. Behind the scenes, he was consumed by the need to preserve dominance, fearing that withdrawal would be seen as weakness, both by enemies abroad and rivals at home. Ultimately, Vietnam became Johnson's undoing. The war cost him public trust, fractured his party and led to his decision not to seek re-election in 1968. Yet his use of power in domestic affairs left a legacy that outlived the failures of foreign policy. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, public broadcasting, and federal education funding still shape American society. Johnson ruled not with virtue, but with results, obtained through tactical brilliance, pressure politics, and controlled chaos. He knew how to appear compassionate in public while wielding fear in private. Precisely what Machiavelli meant when he wrote, "A prince must be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves." Lyndon B. Johnson was both. And in doing so, he redefined what raw executive power could achieve, for better or for worse. Richard Nixon. The master of paranoia and power preservation, Richard Nixon's presidency is one of the most controversial in American history. Often remembered for the Watergate scandal and his dramatic resignation, Nixon was also a deeply strategic leader who embodied many of the Machiavellian principles outlined in The Prince. He was cunning, secretive, paranoid, and driven by an insatiable desire to preserve his power, even at the cost of democratic norms. Machiavelli wrote, "It is necessary for a prince to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge when necessary." Richard Nixon lived by this ethos. Beneath the surface of his carefully rehearsed speeches and anti-communist rhetoric, he was constructing a shadow presidency, one where information was controlled, enemies were neutralized, and power was maintained through fear, surveillance, and silence. Nixon's rise to power was itself Machiavellian. He painted himself as a defender of the silent majority, appealing to traditional values while exploiting public fears of chaos, communism, and cultural decline. In doing so, he cultivated an image of order and strength, a prince who would defend the republic from both external and internal enemies. But what truly defines Nixon's leadership is what happened behind closed doors. He built an enemies list targeting journalists, activists, and political rivals. The FBI, CIA, and IRS were quietly co-opted to investigate or harass these individuals. This was not incidental. It was part of a deliberate attempt to consolidate personal control over federal institutions, reducing the ability of adversaries to challenge him. In The Prince, Machiavelli advises that fear is more reliable than love when it comes to ruling. Nixon's leadership was based on this principle. Members of his inner circle were often intimidated, isolated, or dismissed based on perceived loyalty. Cabinet officials and staff were regularly monitored. Loyalty was rewarded, dissent was punished. His administration operated in tight, hierarchical secrecy where information flowed upward but rarely sideways or down. At the same time, Nixon was capable of brilliant strategic thinking on the international stage. His most Machiavellian achievement was the opening of diplomatic relations with Communist China in 1972, a geopolitical masterstroke. At the height of the Cold War, Nixon shocked the world by visiting Beijing and meeting with Chairman Mao. This move restructured the global power balance, isolating the Soviet Union and introducing a wedge between the world's two major communist powers. Machiavelli advised rulers to make allies of enemies if it serves the state, and that is precisely what Nixon did. He recognized the shifting dynamics of global power and used diplomacy not as a moral act, but as a tool of realpolitik. His outreach to China and détente with the Soviet Union showed his ability to set aside ideological rigidity in favor of strategic advantage, a hallmark of Machiavellian pragmatism. Yet Nixon's fatal flaw was not his strategic mind, but his deep paranoia and obsession with control. This ultimately culminated in the Watergate scandal, where operatives connected to Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The crime itself was politically damaging, but it was Nixon's cover-up, the lies, the hush money, the obstruction of justice, that destroyed his presidency. Machiavelli warned that a prince must be cautious not to become hated, Once public perception turns against a ruler, no amount of cunning can save him. Nixon crossed that threshold. His downfall wasn't because he was Machiavellian, but because he stopped being subtle about it. Still, his legacy is not easily dismissed. He ended the Vietnam War through a combination of diplomacy and escalation, launched the Environmental Protection Agency, and laid the groundwork for modern executive secrecy. His administration showed the world that democracy can be bent, and even broken, by a leader who understands the machinery of fear, image, and control. Nixon didn't lose power because he lacked strategy. He lost it because he took strategy too far, and the mask finally slipped. Ronald Reagan. The actor Prince Ronald Reagan didn't rise to power as a general, a lawyer, or a legislator. He rose as a storyteller, a former Hollywood actor who understood that politics is performance, and power is sustained through perception, narrative, and charisma. His presidency marked a turning point in the use of media and image in governance. Behind the warmth and optimism, Reagan executed a strategic and often aggressive agenda, one that Machiavelli would recognize as a perfect blend of illusion and force. In The Prince, Machiavelli writes, "A prince must always seem to be virtuous, even when he is not." Reagan lived this principle to near perfection. He cultivated an image of a kind, principled, freedom-loving leader while simultaneously overseeing covert operations, strategic deception, and forceful international interventions. He projected peace, but acted with calculated aggression. He smiled, while his policies reshaped the world with sharp precision. Reagan's genius was in his ability to translate complex ideology into emotional clarity. Where other presidents spoke in policy jargon, Reagan spoke in parables: good vs evil, liberty vs tyranny, America vs the evil empire. This narrative construction was not Nauanver, it was strategic myth-making. He built a national story that made Americans feel confident, exceptional, and united. Even as social programs were cut and inequality widened, domestically, Reagan implemented sweeping economic reforms that became known as Reaganomics. These included tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of key industries, and reductions in government spending on social services. While these moves were presented as liberating the free market, critics pointed out their harsh impacts on the working class and the poor. Still, Reagan's ability to frame economic hardship as a necessary path to long-term freedom allowed him to maintain public support. A clear example of Machiavelli's advice that appearances matter more than results in the short term. Internationally, Reagan's approach was bold and at times ruthless. He escalated the arms race against the Soviet Union, dramatically increasing military spending and pushing the US to the edge of nuclear confrontation. The Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), dubbed Star Wars, was a technologically unproven missile defense system. It served less as a real defense measure and more as a psychological weapon, intimidating the Soviet Union into unsustainable military spending. This was classic Machiavellian chess, a bluff presented as strength, forcing the opponent into a position of weakness. At the same time, Reagan's administration engaged in covert operations across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. The most infamous was the Iran-Contra affair, where his administration secretly sold arms to Iran's an enemy state and used the proceeds to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua, all in violation of U.S. law. Reagan denied knowledge, and while legal blame was diverted to subordinates, the scandal revealed the depth of secret statecraft under his watch. Machiavelli taught that rulers must often act outside the law when state interest demands it. Reagan's government embraced this idea, not openly, but through plausible deniability, carefully crafted public messaging, and layers of separation between decision makers and covert actions. What makes Reagan distinct is not just what he did, but how little political damage he suffered for doing it. His approval ratings remained strong. He was re-elected in a landslide. His rhetorical skill and personal charm insulated him from consequences that would have destroyed lesser politicians. He maintained the aura of a virtuous leader while executing ruthless geopolitical strategies. Reagan did not rule with overt cruelty or fear, as some Machiavellian leaders do. Instead, he used optimism as a weapon, charisma as a shield, and narrative as a sword. He understood that in the age of television, a smiling face could mask a steel agenda. He didn't just act like a prince. He performed the role so well, the nation believed the myth he created. George W. Bush. Fear as a tool of power. When George W. Bush entered office in January 2001, he was widely seen as a transitional figure, less ideologically driven than his predecessors, and certainly not expected to reshape the world. That changed in an instant on September 11, 2001. In the chaos that followed, Bush's presidency transformed. Terror became the justification, and fear became the fuel, not only for war, but for a sweeping expansion of executive power. In The Prince, Machiavelli states, "A wise prince should build upon the fear of his subjects when he can't rely on their love." George W. Bush did not cultivate fear deliberately in the beginning, but once it gripped the nation, his administration wielded it masterfully. The post-9/11 world gave Bush what Machiavelli called a favorable occasion, a moment of crisis that could be used to reshape institutions, silence dissent, and elevate the ruler's authority. The first and most significant Machiavellian move came in the form of the USA Patriot Act, passed just weeks after the attacks. Under the banner of national security, the law gave the federal government unprecedented surveillance powers, tapping phone lines, collecting metadata, accessing private records, all without traditional warrants. While the public was told this was to protect them, the deeper truth was that Bush's administration was redesigning the legal limits of executive reach. Fear was instrumental. Americans were told that more attacks were imminent, that enemies were hidden among them, and that freedom must sometimes be sacrificed for safety. This is textbook Machiavellianism, using fear to justify actions that would otherwise provoke outrage. The Bush administration used color-coded threat levels, vague intelligence warnings, and emotionally charged rhetoric to keep the public anxious and compliant. But fear wasn't only a domestic tool. It was the gateway to global transformation. In 2003, the Bush administration launched the invasion of Iraq, citing the threat of weapons of mass destruction, the WMDs, and Saddam Hussein's alleged ties to terrorism. Both claims were later debunked, but at the time, they were accepted by much of the American public and Congress. Not because they were proven, but because they aligned with the climate of fear that had been cultivated. This was Machiavelli in action: create an enemy, amplify the threat, and act decisively, even preemptively, to neutralize it. The shock and awe bombing campaign, the toppling of Saddam's statue, and Bush's infamous mission accomplished moment were all part of a carefully constructed narrative of power, victory, and control. Yet Machiavelli also warned, "Wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you please." As the occupation of Iraq dragged on, the narrative began to crack. The lack of WMDs, the rise of insurgency, and the chaos of post-war reconstruction undermined the legitimacy of the war and Bush's leadership. Still, the executive powers acquired during the War on Terror remained intact long after the initial threats had faded. Bush's foreign policy doctrine, known as the Bush Doctrine, promoted preemptive war and unilateral action, reshaping America's global stance from strategic restraint to aggressive interventionism. This shift profoundly altered international relations and inspired future global tensions and instability. Domestically, dissenters were branded unpatriotic, and the media was subtly co-opted through embedded journalism and selective access. The goal was not to eliminate criticism, but to control the narrative, limit opposition, and centralize authority, all core Machiavellian tactics. Ironically, Bush often spoke of freedom, faith, and morality, yet his most consequential acts, mass surveillance, indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, torture at Abu Ghraib, stood in direct contradiction to those ideals. Still, much of the public accepted them under the logic of fear, as temporary necessities. Machiavelli understood that when people are afraid, they do not ask for justice, they ask for protection. George W. Bush ruled in the shadow of this principle. He did not build a dictatorship, but he used fear to expand executive power in ways that would echo far beyond his presidency, laying the groundwork for a new era of securitized governance. Barack Obama and Donald Trump, two faces of modern Machiavellianism in the 21st century. The American presidency evolved into a global symbol not only of national leadership, but of personalized political branding. In the back-to-back presidencies of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, we find two radically different styles of governance, but both rooted in a common foundation: the strategic use of power, perception, and control, as described by Niccolò Machiavelli in The Prince. While their personalities, rhetoric, and ideologies diverged sharply, Obama and Trump each demonstrated how Machiavellian principles remain timeless tools for preserving power, manipulating perception, and shaping political reality. Barack Obama, the silent strategist Barack Obama, came to power as a symbol of hope, unity, and post-partisan politics. His campaign emphasized dignity, inclusion, and moral leadership. He spoke with calm authority, appealed to intellect and emotion alike, and presented himself as a thoughtful, deliberate statesman. But behind this image was a leader who masterfully employed Machiavellian strategies, particularly in his use of discretion, calculated ambiguity, and institutional dominance. Machiavelli advised that it is not essential that a prince should have all the good qualities, but it is essential that he should seem to have them. Obama exemplified this. While promising transparency, his administration prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. The National Security Agency's NSA, under his watch, vastly expanded its surveillance capabilities, until leaks from Edward Snowden revealed a far-reaching intelligence apparatus monitoring citizens, allies, and adversaries alike. Obama's use of drone warfare, targeted assassinations beyond declared war zones, was justified through legal arguments crafted in secrecy. These strikes often killed not only militants but civilians, including American citizens abroad, without trial. Publicly, Obama maintained an image of reluctant force. Privately, he authorized deadly action through tightly controlled executive processes. His domestic strategy, too, reflected Machiavellian calculation. Facing obstruction in Congress, Obama turned increasingly to executive orders to advance his agenda, particularly on immigration, DACA, and environmental regulation. He navigated institutional gridlock not by persuasion, but by bypassing it. Obama was not feared in the way Machiavelli might have prescribed, but he wielded power quietly, expertly, and surgically, cloaked in civility. Donald Trump, the blunt instrument of division where Obama masked strategy in eloquence, Donald Trump ruled through confrontation, spectacle, and chaos. His presidency rejected subtlety. His leadership thrived not on maintaining a virtuous image, but on weaponizing division and discarding traditional norms. Machiavelli wrote, "A prince who is feared is preferable to one who is loved, if he cannot be both." Trump embraced this to its fullest. He intimidated allies, ridiculed enemies, and elevated loyalty above competence. He reshaped the Republican Party into a vehicle of personal power, enforcing allegiance through threats, public humiliation, and the fear of political annihilation. His media strategy was pure Machiavellian theater. By dominating the news cycle, through insults, crises, or controversy, he ensured that no rival narrative could gain traction. Truth became secondary to repetition. Fake news, witch hunts, and deep state were not just slogans, they were tools for discrediting oversight, demonizing opposition, and undermining institutions. Internally, Trump's administration was defined by constant turnover, secrecy, and centralized control. Like a Machiavellian prince, he distrusted subordinates, demanded loyalty, and sidelined experts. Institutions such as the Department of Justice and intelligence agencies were pressured to serve personal ends, not national ones. His response to the COVID-19 pandemic, civil unrest, and the 2020 election exposed the full scope of his Machiavellian instincts: deny failure, shift blame, claim victory, and never concede weakness. His attempt to overturn the 2020 election and the events of January 6, 2021, represent the most direct threat to American democracy by a sitting president in modern times. Two paths, one principle. Obama and Trump represent two faces of Machiavellianism, one ruled through controlled elegance, the other through raw domination. Both understood that leadership in the modern world depends not only on law or morality, but on the manipulation of image, emotion, and fear. In the end, neither ruled by accident, both ruled by design. From Lincoln's wartime proclamations to Nixon's wiretaps, from Reagan's charming smile to Bush's shadow wars, from Obama's silent drones to Trump's loud defiance, the Oval Office has always been more than a seat of leadership. It's a stage, a place where presidents wear masks of morality while wielding the weapons of power. Machiavelli warned that a ruler must not be good, but appear good, not virtuous, but victorious, not loved, but feared when necessary. And in the American presidency, we have seen both extremes, and everything in between: the illusion of law, the choreography of freedom, the performance of democracy. Yet behind the curtains, behind the speeches, behind the handshake diplomacy, lies a truth as old as Florence. Power survives through calculation. Control is maintained through fear, and history is written by those who understood this first. The founders designed a republic, but the presidents, they ruled like princes. This is not the story we were taught, but it is the one we lived. Machiavelli in the White House, not a question of if, but how far.